And we're going.
Okay, this is better manual web application testing through automation. So first things first, I want to thank you guys for coming out. This is my first B-Sides, so I'm pretty excited about that. So let's get started. I did make some notes, but I've got a puppy at home that kind of ate my homework. True story, right? I checked my bag this morning at the hotel. Yeah, there's chew marks on it. It's great. So thanks, Duke. Okay, these are my resources, 21 tips for making a boring presentation. So if you guys are looking for something boring, you are there. So a little bit about me. I started out as a sysadmin, primarily working on Windows machines, and got interested in security, and it kind of went from there. Even as a kid, I had a strong quest to understand how things worked. One of the stories that my parents tell is that I took apart my bike when I was a kid, and my mom comes home from work and she says, "Well, now you don't have a bike to ride." Well, like an hour later, I had the thing back together and I was riding it. So that's kind of, you got to understand how things work. My security career started out as a SOC analyst on the blue team, which right now I do red team activities, so I do kind of miss the blue stuff because it's fun. So after being on the SOC for a while, I took an interest in offensive security, and I figured I should probably get a certification so I could be a little bit more marketable. So I started with OSCP. I figured that'd be a great starting point. It was one of the most difficult things that I've probably ever done in my life, especially the exam at the end. I was about 2 pots of coffee in, so it was a fantastic experience. So if you ever get a chance to do that, or if you've done that, that's awesome. So right now, I'm a web application pen tester, and that's what I do. And the goal of this talk is to give you guys some idea of like what I do and what I can do to help other people that do web application testing, because some of the stuff is monotonous, and the goal of this talk is to kind of automate some of that to make things easier. So again, disclaimer, this is my opinion, not that of my employer, so that's that. So why do we want to automate things? Well, that's probably why you guys are here, and that's a great question. So it saves time, because no one ever said, I have too much time on my hands to do this test. Consistency. So the thing is, when you're doing tests back to back, a lot of times you run into a problem where you're like, okay, what did I do on that last test? What application was this? Again, accuracy. So you can go back to the client and you can say, hey, this is what I did because I did this. I do this every single time. And it's also easier to teach new testers. So if someone's just getting into testing web applications, it's a great teaching tool. And again, it scales very well. So if you can do something small, then you can do something large if you've got a good plan in place. Testers are lazy, right? I know I am. So another idea for giving this talk and motivation to do it is when I was working on the SOC, that you could see attacks going on where the bad guys were automating things that they do. So the one vulnerability that I really like is shell shock, because you can see the different payloads that they used. Again, shell shock is the bash vulnerability where you could see attacks come in and they were actually injecting commands into the web server. So that's pretty fun to analyze some of that. The malware automates as well. It spreads without user interaction. I think we can all think of examples of that just came up recently. In fact, one of them was talked about in the keynote. So great example of that. Botnets, again, examples in the news recently of how bad guys are automating the botnets. And the Dridex malware. This is one of my favorite malwares because it scans memory to look for credit card numbers. And I think scanning memory is a pretty powerful thing. So this is the first example because you have to walk before you can run. So in this example, I created a simple script that will essentially enumerate the IP addresses on the network. So this is written in Bash. This is pretty much automation 101. So I will have the slides available at the end, or you can email me, and I can give you a copy of those if you guys aren't able to see it. So essentially, we create a range from 1 to 254, right? Because that's how many IP addresses are in a subnet. So once we do that, we can pipe that information into ping, and it'll basically enumerate through all those IP addresses, and at the end, we can actually grep for bits from. So then at the script output, we get a nice little bit of information that tells us just the IP addresses that are up on the network. If you guys do have any questions, feel free to just interrupt. This is pretty informal here. So once we find out what's out on the network, the next thing to do is we need to scan. Because now that we found a host that's up, we need to see what that host offers. So, there's several tools to do that. We can use Nmap, Nikto. I like Nikto. I'm a big fan of that, especially coming from the OSCP world. Directory Buster, Burp Scanner. I love Burp Scanner. I primarily do my testing in that application. And some of you guys are probably doing automation right now, so the list goes on. So one of the things we can do with Nmap is we can scan an IP address range with Nmap. And in the example here, I'm primarily looking for ports 80 and 443, right? Because that's our web interface. So we need to identify the web servers that exist on the network. And what we can do is we can take the Nmap information and we can pipe it out using the -OG. That's for original gangster. Actually, it's greppable format, but I like OG, right? And then we can pipe that into Nikto. And if you're using Kali, if you do an update to the latest version of Nikto, which is included with Kali, it'll have this functionality built in. So we can pipe that information from Nmap to Nikto. And on the next slide, I kind of break it down for how that command looks. So there's a lot of Nmap switches, and so you can look at port 80, 443, just as I talked about earlier, and that's going to give us our web traffic. So again, I talked about if you're using Kali, this presentation is primarily designed for users of Kali because it's a standard platform throughout, so you don't have to worry about what version you're running. If you just update it, then you should be fine. So again, with Nmap, we can banner grab for running services that exist on the network. Nmap also has the ability to use NSE scripting, which is the Nmap scripting engine. So a lot of that has built-in vulnerability scanning as well. And in this next example, I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So what we can do with Nmap is we can take the information that we get from Nmap and we can export it as an XML. So the great thing about an XML is it's pretty much like the universal format that Metasploit can read from. We can import that information into Searchsploit, which if you guys use Kali, Searchsploit is built in, and it's basically an offline version of Exploit DB. So if you're on an engagement and you're trying to find out what vulnerabilities exist for, WordPress or a Java plugin or something like that, like Searchsploit is very, very easy to use. And if you use Searchsploit that's installed with Kali, then you don't have to worry about the CAPTCHA when you search on Exploit DB. So in this example here, you can call out Searchsploit, and if you do the --nmap and then supply that XML document, then it will take that XML and it will run through Searchsploit and find the different versions, the banners that exist on those servers, and it will actually look for vulnerabilities for it. So in this case, I use Metasploitable. for these slides because it's a great learning tool. And as you can see here, there's the VSFTPD with the backdoor command injection that was identified. This is just a small excerpt of pages and pages of stuff that it found for Metasploitable. So after we've kind of worked at the OS layer, now we can get into automating the web browser. So when I first thought about this, I was like, well, why would I want to automate the web browser? Why wouldn't I just use a web browser, right? Because that's what it's designed to do. But then I realized that if you script those actions, it's faster, it's easily repeatable, and you can use regex. So I know there's some guys out there that like to use regex. So this is like right up your alley. So there was recently a botnet that was using automating web browsers to basically create fraud for click ads. So they had a whole farm of servers that were basically fake browsing the internet, and this is where I kind of got the idea from. So for this example, I chose to go with mechanized. And this is available in several different formats. In this example, we're going to use Python. So in just 4 lines of code, you can easily request a page and print the information. So that's why I chose mechanized. And I know this works with Ruby and Perl as well. So if you guys develop in either of those languages, there's that availability as well. So these 4 lines, this will take the information from the page and display it out. So what we can do is we can look to see what headers are in place, and we can also see the cookies that are being sent back and forth. So one of the things that I do during a test is I look to see if the secure flag is set on the cookie as well as the HTTP only. So this is a great way to do that. Mechanized also has the ability to manage cookies. And it uses basically the same cookie jar that Burp uses, if you're familiar with that. So again, you got to walk before you can run. So in this next example, we're actually logging in to the web application because after all, most of the applications that I test have logins because they need to be secure, right? So this adds just a couple more lines of code, and as you can see, it's very human readable. So even if you're not that familiar with Python, there's still a lot you can just look at this and figure out what's going on. So br.form, obviously that's the username, and then the password for the form field. So in order to get this, all you have to do is look at the source code of the web page, and that'll give you that information. So in this example, we're using the DVWA, which is Damn Vulnerable Web Application. This is one of my favorites because it's simple. Again, I like simple. And then the last option down there actually emulates the submit button. So it, for all intents and purposes, looks like that the user is clicking the submit button. So again, I talked about this earlier. This is the display of the information that we got back, that print r.info, and we can see some of the powered by PHP, the date. We can also see the cache settings on there as well. So again, this is very easy to do, and it will be quick to get back information. So again, we've got the banner information. We can check for the different flags that are present. Also the cross-site scripting flag to see where scripts can be loaded from. Also testing for cross-site request forgery. So a lot of applications will implement the cross-site request forgery token that will show up in these displays as well. So now that we've kind of talked about Python, now we're going to move into Burp. Again, this is one of my favorite testing tools. So we're actually going to walk through showing you how to create a Burp macro And what it will do is, if Burp detects that your session is terminated, it will automatically log you back in. And I came up with this idea when I was working on a test, and I found a place that I knew was vulnerable to cross-site scripting. But every time that I would use a malicious payload, so every time it would see a caret or a quote or a bracket or something like that, it would log me out of the application. So I'm like, well, that's no good. This is really going to slow me down. So that's how I came up with this idea of using macros. I think, all great inventions are driven by a need. So, anytime you have a need and you write a tool to fix it, I think that's pretty awesome. So I've got I wanted to do a demo, but I was kind of nervous to do demos because I know sometimes the demo gods don't cooperate. So I did a video, and I hope everybody can see this. So again, we're using the damn vulnerable web application. So what we're going to do is we're essentially going to log in, and we're going to look at that traffic inside of Burp, and then we're going to create that macro to replay that traffic. So the first thing we need to do, like step one, is to log in. And kind of behind the scenes, I've already got Burp set up, and I'm already capturing that traffic. So right now I'm logging into the application. So this is a little, I think the resolution's a little bit off, so hopefully you guys can still see. So in the blurry text, again, I apologize, we can see the traffic that has been sent back and forth. So it looks like the login process is 4 requests. So basically you request the page, you log in, and then it displays the page. So what we're doing here is just checking the HTTP history to make sure that we have that traffic. Once we have the traffic, we can begin creating the macro. So once we're inside of Burp, if we go to project options, and I know it's kind of hard to see because of the resolution, but you can kind of see up there, it's the tab closest to the right. So once we click on that, so we'll click on project options, and then down here towards the bottom, there's an option to add a macro, and you can kind of see the add button, but it's still a little blurry down there. And again, I can email these slides out if you guys aren't able to read it.
Sure.
Yes.
With the macros, can you use this with Burp free, or do you have to have the license for it?
I did this demo with the free version, okay. So absolutely. That's one of the cool things that this works even with the free version. So with the macros located down towards the bottom end of the screen, if you click the add button, that will bring up that list of traffic that we saw earlier in the HTTP history. So what we're doing here is we're essentially going to select the traffic that we want to replay. So again, a macro is just recorded actions that we did. We're automating that process. So we're going to, I think it's control to select multiple events on there. And then once we have those selected, then we can click OK. And there's a button here that's still kind of blurry that says Test Macro. And that will actually replay the traffic. So the next thing we need to do is, we've got our traffic recorded and we've created a macro. So the next thing we need to do is identify the conditions that exist to replay that traffic. And again, this is a simple example of if Burp detects that your user session has been terminated or you've been logged out. This can work for any number of things. If you're trying to test, cross-site request forgery tokens, login tokens, anything that you need to replay over and over again, this will work. And this is a great tool. So if you've never used this before, I encourage you to play around with it because it's pretty powerful stuff. So what we're doing here is, this is the sessions or the conditions that exist for what we need to do to replay that traffic. So what we're doing in this, if we view the tab, there's a, you can't see it, but there's an option in there that says if session is terminated, then run this macro. So what we're going to do is select our macro and then click OK. And one caveat to making this work successfully, and I struggled with this when I was setting it up, there's an option in here that says only run this macro if. So only run this macro if you're in repeater, if you're in intruder. So essentially what you're doing is setting the scope. So the option that we need to select in here is the option for proxy, because without selecting proxy, it won't run as you're browsing the site or you're scanning the site. In fact, that's another good thing to mention. If you've got the professional version of Burp and you're scanning the site and for some reason your session terminates, if you have this macro set up, it will automatically log you back in. I think I stopped that. So once we've got our macro set, what we can do is log out of the application to test to make sure this is going to work properly. So as you can see, I'm clicking the log out button down there. And now we're logged out. So the next step is to request a page that requires authentication. And what Burp will do is it will say, oh, it looks like my session's invalid. I'm going to run this macro. So we'll be able to watch this in the video here. And it takes a little bit longer because it's got to identify that the session is terminated and then replay the macro. So in this example, I'm going to like the upload page, the cross-site request forgery page. And it's working properly. If there's time at the end, I think I've got a copy of Burp on my laptop, so we can run through that. So another great benefit to using these macros is if you're doing something a little bit more complicated, you can actually record, like let's say you find cross-site scripting, and once you write up your report, a lot of times the developers ask, well, how did you get to this page? What payload did you use? What does the traffic look like? So what you can do is you can actually record this macro and save it and give it to the developer, and then they can watch the traffic to see what's going on, how you navigated to the page, the different payloads that you use to spawn that cross-site scripting or whatever the vulnerability is. Again, it's a great teaching tool. So you can take, you can have the senior tester create this macro, and then for a retest, when the application team patches the vulnerability, then you can give that macro to a junior tester, and it makes it a lot easier for them to replay that traffic and retest it. So a couple caveats. Troubleshooting macros. The session management is really big, so if you can see it, there's when you configure the macro, you have to tell it to instead of reusing the cookie that already exists, you have to tell it to get that new cookie from the web server and replay it. Because if you don't, it'll never work. So now that we've talked about, scripting in, Nmap, simple bash scripting, now we're going to talk about Metasploit and the different scripts that exist and custom scripts you can create in Metasploit. So, once you do find that vulnerability and you do get a foothold in the network, one of the things that you do first is look around, right? You got to see what loot is available, and you have to find a way to persist. So if you script those actions, it's the same action every single time. So if the client asks, well, what did you do to gain access, and how did you pivot once you got into the network? Well, you can say, well, we run these scripts, and this is what we do every single time. So the other part of that, just the reverse of that, is when the engagement is over, it makes it really easy to remove your backdoor, remove any files that exist on those machines that you've compromised, because you can basically unrun the script and it will remove that. So just some quick information about Metasploit scripting. They're written in Ruby. So if you guys know Ruby, that's awesome, because I don't. But there's plenty of examples that exist out on the internet. So I kind of learned to code from necessity. If there's something that I find that I need to learn how to do, that's basically my interest in coding. And there's a bunch of pre-existing scripts that exist in the Metasploit framework, and I've got the URL saved up there. So you can either look at those or you can run them to see how they work, what they do. Unfortunately, the Metasploit scripts are no longer supported by Metasploit. They're no longer updated, but they still exist in the scripting engine. Is still there. So there's scripts, and there's also RC files, like basically resource files. So these are recorded commands that can be played back in Metasploit, kind of like a bash RC file. So it can contain Ruby code. A great example is you can use this for enumeration or post exploitation, and you can also clean up after exploitation and after the engagement's over. So this is a screenshot of the existing scripts. So I'm sure some of you guys use these right now and may not know where they came from. Like some of the examples are like kill AV, migrate. I know I use migrate a lot. If you're spawned in a process that's not stable and you need to migrate that to a different process, that's a great script for that resource. Also webcam, if you're interacting with if you're on a laptop and you're interacting with the webcam, that's the resource script that exists. And all of these are saved in plain text, so you can go in and see how they work and maybe even combine them. So again, this is a simple example to get us started. So what this is a .rc or a resource file. So one of the common things that I do on an engagement is set up a listener, right? Because everything is spawned through a reverse shell, because like who has just a firewall open that will accept new connections and not have them be a reverse shell. So I find myself doing this a lot. So I've got to set up my handler, I've got to select my payload, I've got to set my port and my IP address. So this is a script that I created that does that for me. So again, it's just a couple lines of code. So we're defining what exploit we want to use. So in this case, it's the multi-handler, and our payload is going to be Metinterpreter reverse TCP, and we're setting our local port, which is going to be the port that the machine calls back on, and then the L host down there is going to be the IP address of the machine we're working on. So to execute the RC script is very simple. If you save it in the resource directory, you can just call it out by resource and then the name of your script. If you don't do it that way, then you have to call out the full path. So in this case, you type in resource /root/listener.rc, and you can see the output there. It selects the exploit we're using, selects the payload we're using, the port, and the return IP address. Another cool thing is there's an auto run feature in Meterpreter. So just like in the way back when you put the CD in your CD-ROM, it would pop up with auto run. That feature exists in Metasploit. So a great use for this is once you get a reverse shell, you can execute a series of commands that will, we talked earlier about migrating the processes, enumerate the host to see what exists, enumerate the network interfaces to see what networks this computer is connected to in case it's a multi-home machine. So I've created a simple example for basic Linux privilege escalation. A lot of this work is taken from GotMelk, which is from Offensive Security. It's a great resource if you're trying to escalate from, let's say, like the Apache user account to root on a Linux box. It's great for that. So what I've done is take the most common things that I use from that script and incorporate it, kind of put my own spin on it. So in this example, we are taking that script and importing it into Metasploit. And basically, any bash command can be run in Metasploit if you wrap it in Ruby. So it takes bash commands, and it also has its own proprietary commands as well. So in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to get the system information, such as the target OS. We're going to see if we can enumerate the etc issue, so we can see what version of Linux this is running, because sometimes if you find a web host, and let's say it's running Tomcat Apache, right? Well, that means it could either be Linux or it could be Solaris. So we have to identify that information, because if we're going to post-exploit this machine, we need to figure out what our OS is. And if we're starting out as that Apache user account, we need to figure out what's installed and what vulnerabilities exist, so we can escalate to that admin account. So this is our list of commands. What we're going to do here, we're going to execute the command, and then we're going to return it back to the console. And we're going to save this as priv_esc.rb. So this is the output of the script. So essentially, this is once you've got your Meterpreter shell back, you can run this script, and it will take those commands, run it on the remote host, and give you the information back. So as you can see, the first thing it does is get the system information. So it's a Linux OS, Metasploitable. It's running, version kernel 2.6.24. Now, if you're familiar with this version of the kernel, you know there's all kinds of privilege escalations that are available, because this is an older kernel. So we can see, what time it is on the system. If you're working on something remotely in a different time zone, that can be helpful as well. You can also get the computer name. So a lot of times people name their computer name something that's close to the function. So this could help you to identify what the possible function is of this machine. So does it do, reporting? Does it connect to a mainframe? Like, what does it do? So the end goal of automation is that it simplifies things. You run the same task over and over again. It makes doing mundane things a little bit more enjoyable, right? It streamlines the testing process, and the idea is that it saves more time for doing manual testing. So at this time, if you guys have questions, I know we're kind of done a little bit early. I'd like to answer those now. And actually, let me see if I've got Burp installed here. Maybe not. I might have deleted it. Let me go back to the presentation here so you guys can get my email address if you're interested in getting a better copy of the video. So, question, yes?
Yeah, so for the Python that you showed early on in the presentation,
Yes.
or the Python library rather, how much control do you have over modifying the requests, or would you have to put Burp suite in between that and the website you're testing if you want to manipulate the actual request?
So the question was, using Python and the mechanized library, how much can you manipulate the initial request? So there's a lot of things you can change. So when I do a test, sometimes you can set it to ignore robots.txt because right out of the box, mechanized will not scan those directories. You can also change the user agent string.
Yeah.
So I mean, you can be anything from an iPhone to a BlackBerry to a Windows machine. There's a lot of functionality in there. Also, if you're testing for, if you're doing like the shell shock, you can actually customize that so you can put your shell shock payload inside of that user agent string. You can also set cookies. You can manually set cookies. So like for the DVWA, you can actually set the security cookie to low or medium when you log in. So, yeah, so there's a lot you can do with that. It's a great question. Was there another question I saw? Okay. Well, thanks for coming.
Where's your microphone pack? Don't do anything. Just turn
it off. Turn it off.